All right, YouTube. You may have seen that Steve Bannon, who works directly with Trump, is almost arguably more powerful than Mike Pence at this point within the Trump White House. Declared some time ago that it was likely we would have a shooting war over the South China Sea, specifically between the U.S. and China. Unfortunately, he's probably right. Now, I'm not sure about his additional prediction that we would be in a major war in the Middle East around the same time. That really depends on the actions of state actors, honestly, within the Middle East. As if Iran continues to completely hardball the U.S., if relations break down further, not only would that harm us insofar as we're trying to establish proper diplomacy with the Russians, it would also potentially endanger us with regards to Iran. Now, of course, Iran can't attack the U.S. It doesn't have the projective capability in any way, shape, or form to operate outside of its area. It can certainly hazard U.S. vessels that are getting near Iran. Beyond that, it can't really do much. But I don't think that you would want to try to attack them offensively. I think it'd be a little bit different than when we ousted Saddam Hussein. You'd probably get much stiffer resistance, much more manpower dedicated to trying to stop you. Iran is a sad story anyway, of course. Back in the 70s, before that, they were virtually a secular nation. A lot of times people forget that they had more of the almost paganized level Persian culture. They didn't have any burqas. Women didn't have to wear headscarves. They had disco music and everything else. And it was kind of like Afghanistan up until that point. The wave of Islamic evangelism that's hit the Middle East. It's like when people talk about women should be allowed to wear the burqa. Well, women were protesting against having to wear burqas in those countries when they became totalitarian under their theocratic rule at the time. And sometimes people forget that. The burqa is a symbol of the repression of females in Islamic cultures around the Middle East. It's a fairly new thing, generally speaking. Some of them were more secular than many Christian nations up until that crap happened. A lot of people forget that. But Iran would be much stiffer than Iraq under Saddam. Greater manpower, presumably greater military capabilities in a more general scope. Has powerful allies within the region. If you go after Iran, you're going after Assad. You're getting fucked by Hezbollah. It would be more difficult. Saddam was basically without allies at the time that we attacked him for the most part. Because he had either gassed, invaded, or threatened to gas or invade most of his neighbors. So nobody, I guess, really cared when we went in with shock and awe. I bet in retrospect, a lot of the more secular individuals around that region wish that they had defended Saddam at the time. Iran would be sort of the last domino to fall as far as these Shia states go. With China, though, it probably is unavoidable. You've got to look at the delicate situation here. It doesn't directly involve the United States. It's not that the South China Sea is in our backyard and we're trying to outmuscle the Chinese for its territory. We declared an international water area. Most of its neighbors do at least some of this. They also have their own long-standing claims. The difficulty is that all of the other nations that have a claim on any of the water in the South China Sea are now U.S. allies. The Vietnamese have now entered the Western fold. Malaysia, especially with regards to trade, is in the Western fold, and I believe also has an alliance with Australia. Japan and South Korea and Taiwan are fairly self-explanatory. The Philippines are sort of taking a middle road now under Duterte, but at the same time, their main alliance is with the West. Their main trade is with the West. They've been, for many decades, one of the greatest friends the United States has actually had, one of the most pro-American states on the face of the earth, more so than the United States itself in some polling. So if China actually gets too aggressive, several things could happen. First and foremost, it could spark a U.S. response. Secondly, though, and this is probably the more likely scenario, it could spark a response from any of these other states with which we have alliances, and they get us involved. And once we get involved, the Chinese may back down, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. If we get into it with China in a more standard warfare scenario, where we're, using conventional weapons against one another. The Chinese will fall fairly quickly. But what's to say that they don't unleash a nuclear hellstorm on all of their sort of East and South Pacific neighbors? East and South Asian neighbors when they begin to lose. The Chinese do not have the naval and air power necessary to defend against all of these nations at once, let alone with the United States involved. It could go nuclear. And that would really be a remarkably bad scenario. Now, China's total stockpile, a large proportion of it would have to be used just on those Asian nations in the region. India could very well get involved. They have disputed land with China. Pakistan could very well get involved. You could see an interesting phenomena whereby India and Pakistan, they usually viciously hate one another and have their own border skirmishes, say fuck this, and both gang rape China at the same time and ignore one another, and they're actually fighting on the same side. Thailand could get involved. The Burmese could get involved. And the Bhutanese could march out of the mountains and get involved. People from Nepal or something like that. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that if China makes a major mistake, it will begin to get clusterfucked by all of its neighbors. The Russians could very well as well get involved. They could begin grabbing up Chinese land. I don't believe, by the way, that the Russians in retrospect are happy that they gave nuclear technology to the Chinese. I think they feel very concerned that their dominance in Asia has been threatened by the existence of a powerful China. China is still, on a nuclear level, they're way behind the Russians. On the level of their overall air capabilities, they're behind the Russians. Economically speaking, though, and increasingly in a naval sense, they're ahead of Russia. I think people like Putin don't like this fact. China can't be contained. Putin tried to go over and sign a very lucrative deal with China, I believe, 2 years ago, where they'd say, oh, we're going to build a pipeline into China. We got all this oil. You need all this oil, maybe displace some of this coal that you're using, clean things up. We'll run a pipeline down there, and then you pay us for the oil. But once the pipeline was already completed on the Russian side, the Chinese said, oh, you're also going to have to pay for the construction of it on our end in China. And Putin grumbles about that. Oh, and we're paying you less per unit of oil as well, and don't expect any continued Chinese maintenance. So Russia actually got stiffed by the Chinese on this major fuel deal, endangering the very essence of BRICS. BRICS is additionally endangered by the fact that increasingly it looks like nothing more than China investing in the three less developed states that are in BRICS and ignoring the Russians and using them as little more than diplomatic leverage. I think the Russian people feel slightly used by the Chinese, honestly, to the point at which maybe their swing towards making more friendly remarks towards the United States makes a little bit more sense. We could see an interesting scenario where China ends up virtually friendless, with the exception of a few, North Korea or maybe the Mongolians or something, and ends up hostile towards virtually all of its neighbors. There are also Islamic states that don't like the Chinese because there are Islamic majority provinces in parts of Western China that are suppressed in their religiosity. There are Tibetan revolutionaries. There are certainly liberal revolutionaries in all parts of China that nonetheless, they don't dare to openly oppose the Chinese government. Last time we had that happen, a lot of people ended up getting beaten on, Tiananmen Square. China is a paper palace. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Ultimately, their economy is weak. The problem is that when China realizes that its economy is weak, all hell might break loose in their state, and they might go full imperialist mode, say, okay, South China Sea is ours. Maybe we should invade North Korea and just take it ourselves because it's an embarrassment. Maybe we should take the disputed land along the Indian and Pakistani borders before they develop modern nuclear weapons and just take it for ourselves. By the way, Taiwan is ours. Any number of mistakes could be made. The diplomatic situation in Southeast Asia is far worse than it is anywhere else in the world. That includes the Middle East. We're more likely to end up in a war with the Chinese at this point than we are a war with any major Middle Eastern power. Turkey, well, yeah, they're going rogue. They're partnering with the Russians, but we're sort of doing that too in a way. As for NATO, yeah, they're a member, although NATO is becoming more fragile over time as the EU begins to dissolve. Some people conflate the EU and NATO. which is preposterous. It's dumb, but they still do. The only problem with some of these nationalistic movements in Europe is that some of them want to leave NATO, honestly. They don't seem to realize that its purpose can be completely redrawn. We could admit Russia to NATO and form one massive alliance that can curb stomp any enemy. Nobody apparently has thought of the relative virtue of doing this yet. God forbid that we should rule the world, I suppose. We could. Be easy. You need 4 nations, US, UK, France, and Russia. And collectively they could carve up most of the rest of the world if they really wanted to. Not saying that I can support the idea of committing mass genocide against the third world and simply carving it into colonial provinces, but they could. It's feasibly, physically possible, and collectively would have the projective force to do so. If you had the consent of some of the other European nations, gave them some freebies and handouts too. Maybe let them have nukes, It's not like they're going to attack each other with them. But Bannon is probably right. My estimate of the possibility of nuclear war, or the possibility of a major worldwide conventional war situation, like a World War III minus nuclear weapons, is largely prefaced on China, and the situation in the Middle East has very little at this point to do with Russia. Russia is softballing the West, with the exception of Ukraine. There, I think, we should put up a wall against the Russians, make it clear, we want to work with you diplomatically. You've already taken Crimea. Why not leave the rest of Ukraine alone, and through favorable trade status, as opposed to embargoes and sanctions, the economy will surge right ahead. It's possible to do. If you have less alienation in Russia, then you won't have hardliners elected. That's the other part. Hardline parties arise when there's social alienation. It's happening all over Europe. It's like UKIP. A while back, the very concept of a Brexit would have been considered quite fringe and insane indeed, until people became more and more alienated by Brussels. Then all of a sudden it became feasible, because even though it was sort of a wild, lunatic thing to do, it was preferable to the status quo, because the status quo was so bad. This is how parties fall. This is how nations fall in some cases. Within China, the Chinese government has already made a series of fundamental errors in its doctrine. One of its fundamental errors is it seems to be under the assumption that if it has to use its military force, it'll be against the US alone, that it won't have to deal with all of these other Asian states suddenly deciding to butt-fuck them. Another problem is it makes investments that never pan out, and it's wasting its productivity, and its growth is stalling out. Well, as long as the growth continued, it doesn't matter if they waste billions and billions of dollars, run up a huge tab of debt. It doesn't matter, because the growth is continuing. It outpaces the amount of spending largely, and everything is nice and even Stevens. Growth continues, their economy gets more powerful, they invest more in their military, the military buys goods within China, and they grow even further. But it's beginning to stop, and that's causing problems. Why I've noticed, I said, others have said too, the fortifications that China is making in the South China Sea are not being made from a position of strength. It's not like they said, okay, now we have the power to expand, and so we're going to make these defensive fortifications with which we can launch strikes on all of these other Asian nations. They're doing that because they're afraid of being largely precluded from the area. They're afraid the United States, its most major buyer, will start buying from India or something else. Rip them out of BRICS and start buying their cheap goods. China will become a pariah. China's economy will begin to slide backwards, and they'll no longer have the capability to continue bullying their neighbors in the South China Sea to show their dominance. Therefore, it makes sense to build fortifications that are largely inexpensive. They're basically immobile, supersized aircraft carriers, and it allows them to hold that area within their dominance permanently. Now, it's mostly symbolic, because if their military got a solid beating, they wouldn't be able to staff these islands, but they'd still be there. They'd still be there as a symbol of Chinese dominance within the region. It's to the point where the Chinese are claiming, as their territorial waters, everything up to within a few miles of the coast of places like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Well, clearly, China doesn't have carte blanche to simply grab up every nautical mile of water in the Pacific. The United States could, if it wanted to sort of shame the Chinese, I guess, just declare the whole Pacific Ocean our territorial waters. That's not international waters anymore. Everything up to this land being, this sea being claimed by China, oh, it's all ours. It's all ours. And we're going to build bases. We're going to float our aircraft carriers around, and nobody's going to challenge us because we have naval superiority. And the Chinese would not like that, I presume. But if we ever did that, it wouldn't be from a position of strength. Position of strength is we have the ability to float around in these international waters unchallenged. We can do that at a whim. None would dare claim any of that water because we'd beat their ass, and we wouldn't recognize their claim. Even in the South China Sea, even Obama had the foresight to send a couple of destroyers through that region into that claimed territorial water, and the Chinese did nothing. That's because those fortifications that they've built are for if they need to invade Taiwan or pound Japan or something like that, and as a show of force. It's not like they actually intend to start targeting U.S. aircraft carriers floating around in the region or anything like that. It would be a huge mistake to do so. But get another wave of hardliners in China, and they may decide the U.S. will back down if we do attack them, and so we should attack them. It would be a huge mistake. It's, people underestimate the resolve of the United States to defend its interests, and they've done that before throughout history, and it's never worked out well for them. When we go into a third world nation, start dicking around in a political manner, Iraq, Vietnam, wherever it happens to be, we almost inevitably lose. But when somebody else tries to take a piss on us, we end up curb stomping them, sometimes out of existence altogether. Nations get completely crippled by our armed forces when that happens. So it would be not in the best interest of the U.S. to overly perturb the Chinese, but it is in the best interest of the United States to make it clear that we don't respect their territorial claims. The islands that they're building mean nothing to us and will float right past them, and there's nothing they can do about it. And that no other Asian nation has to regard their territorial claims as true either. We do need to make more inroads into Russia. Because if China begins, let's just say that the possibility happens, that China economically collapses, falls into chaos, and a bunch of total hardline imperialists take charge. Or the nation fractures. There are rogue nuclear states all of a sudden that exist within that region. We're going to need Russia's help to solve the problem. Partially on behalf of the people of China. Can you imagine how insane it would be? They'd be killing each other at that point. We would need to restore order. The only way we're going to fucking do that is if we have Russia's help, as well as the help of all these other Asian states. We could get two things accomplished at the same time. We could reunite the Korean Peninsula and solve all of the disputes with splinter groups within China and disputed territory without China. Try to transition them into, a nation that's actually a republic. Maybe it'll function better than our dysfunctional republic at that point. That'd be even funnier. All of a sudden, China becomes more free than the United States or something like that. It could happen. At this point, our government's so overstretched in its function. Yeah, you could see like Russia or China supplant us as a more free state at some point in the future if they had a mind to do so. That'd be real fucking sad. That'd be a total wash. That's about all. Peace out.